Welcome to the 121st episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Beatriz Williams, author of the new novel, 100 Summers. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Beatriz Williams, the author of the new novel, 100 Summers. Beatriz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Sure. Well, first, could I ask you to read the first page or two of your new novel, 100 Summers?
Very well. Sounds good. I'll start then with Chapter 1, Route 5, 10 miles south of Hanover, New Hampshire, October 1931. 112 miles of curving pavement lie between the entrance gates of Smith College and the Dartmouth football stadium, and Budgie drives them, as she does everything else, hell for leather. The leaves shimmer gold and orange and crimson against a brilliant blue sky, and the sun burns unobstructed overhead, teasing us with a false sense of warmth. Budgie has decreed we drive with the top down, though I am shivering in the draft, huddled inside my wool cardigan, clutching my hat. She laughs at me. "You should take off your hat, honey. You remind me of my mother holding on to her hat like that, like it's the end of civilization if someone sees your hair." She has to shout the words with the wind gusting around her. "It's not that," I shout back. "It's because my hair, released from the enveloping dark wool felt cloche, will expand into a western tumbleweed, while Budgie's sleek little curls only whip around artfully before settling back in their proper places at journey's end." Even her hair conforms to Budgie's will. But this explanation is far too complicated for the thundering draft to tolerate, so I swallow it all back, pluck the pins out of my hat, and toss it on the seat beside me.
Great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about 100 Summers yet, how would you describe the novel?
Well, I guess when I was first telling my agent about this idea I said it was a bit like high society meets a perfect storm. I've always really been fascinated by the 1938 hurricane, which, if listeners aren't aware of it or know the details, it kind of thundered ashore without warning at the very end of summer in September. And, it was really just a devastating event for New England, and it blew away entire beach communities. And I just thought what would be interesting was, what happened during one of these beach communities during that hot and sweaty summer, and how would that cataclysm affect the world around them. And so I really wanted to explore all the sort of tangled relationships going on in one of these classic old lost social networks, and I'll explore a bit of a love story as well, because to me what's really interesting about the period is all the transformation taking place in sexual relationships, in romantic relationships, in the culture as a whole.
Sure. And you said that you were familiar with the hurricane of 1938, the New England hurricane. Did you do a lot of research prior to or while you were writing the book?
Not so much while I was writing. It was more to make sure I had, this or that fact straight, and I'd look it up. I did obviously a fair amount of research before I started. There are several nonfiction books on the subject, and what had really captured my imagination was the story of Napa Point, which is sort of a sandy cape, if you want to give it a more dignified name, coming off of Watch Hill in Rhode Island. And there were some, a collection of, I think, 40 or 45 lovely beach cottages there. And they were all swept away, not so much by the force of the storm itself, but by the storm surge that came in a sort of a tidal wave. It wasn't sort of this gradually rising water. It was literally like a bank of fog on the horizon that people sort of gradually realized was, it's a 20-foot high wall of water coming towards them. So it was really this almost, tsunami that blew away all the houses. And the houses were never rebuilt. I mean, if you survived that, you rode across Little Narragansett Bay on your rooftop or, whatever you could possibly grab onto that would float, and hopefully you made it across. But the spit itself, Napa Tree Point, nothing was ever rebuilt there, and now it's just sort of beach and dunes being eaten away further by the action of the sea.
Sure. Well, I know that 100 Summers is being marketed as a great summer novel or beach read. I was curious, as a reader yourself, are there books that you consider great beach reads that you go back to and read?
I think everyone has their own idea of what makes a great beach read, and obviously if you're reading something about the beach, that it really brings it home. But I think what makes a read a great beach read is just that sense of immersion, where, you don't want to sort of take a break between chapters, where you just want to sit there and you can sit for hours and occupy that lovely, lazy summer time. So, anything that's sort of big and absorbing will do that. And it's often, to me, it means more of either a genre read or a more commercial read, because, that tends to be what, I guess, absorbs us whole into the world of the novel. I'm just looking at my bookshelf here, and gosh, I love the Maisie Dobbs books. Those are great to sit down and just swallow them whole in a single read. Karen White writes some wonderful books that are set in the South, and they tend to go back and forth between the present day and then some sort of mysterious episode in the past, and those are always great reads. So to me, that's sort of what makes a beach read great, but of course everyone has their own idea.
Sure. Well, you mentioned earlier about the setting of 100 Summers being the 1930s and the changing nature of relationships and sexuality. Was that something that you needed to research in terms of just figuring out the social relationships and how people were dealing with those things at that time period?
It's something that I have been fascinated with since I think the transformative event was when I was in college. I think it was my junior year, and I took a class on turn of the century Europe. And obviously you had a lot going on at that time. There was a modernist strain in art and in literature, and there was all this technology going on. But what really turned us into the society we are today is the First World War, and the cataclysm that represented for Western civilization. And it was really that sort of let loose, what I would call the real sexual revolution, which didn't necessarily take place in the 60s, really started taking place in the 20s. You had the invention of the latex condom, just on a practical level. Before then, it was either some sort of, form of animal skin or it was rubber, real rubber. And so that, is one thing that sort of allowed birth control to be much easier, readily available, easier to use, pleasant to use. You had fashions were changing. You had women taking a much sort of greater role in public life. You had prohibition, which all of a sudden threw men and women together in public drinking situations. Before then, I mean, even in private homes, you would have a gentleman, going off to drink brandy, and the women would go to the drawing room. So you had this kind of separation of social drinking. And then after Prohibition, though, you'd go to speakeasies, you were kind of driven underground, and when men and women are drinking together, certain things naturally come about. You had a general sense that the old world had broken down, that these values that we had, things like, virtue and honor and nobility, that these things had been proven to be meaningless on the battlefield of the First World War, because that was what got you killed. So there was this sense that the old rules were being washed away. You had these practical barriers that were being lifted to greater intercourse, literally as well as figuratively. And you also had greater numbers of women going to college. Before 1920, it was really, if you were a very studious, loose-stocking sort of girl, you could maybe convince your parents to let you go to college. After 1920, you had this growing middle class, growing prosperity. It became sort of a status symbol to send your daughter off to college as well as the boys. And, even though the dorms and all the rules there sort of, they were careful to make sure that there were rules and regulations in place. You've got young men and women together. Life will find a way, as I think it's in Jurassic Park. Love as well as life will find a way. So you really had this tremendous growth in the sense that you could actually have sex outside of marriage and it wasn't a bad thing. You had the opportunity, and people started taking advantage, and that was sort of by the time we got to the 60s, that was really already there. And I know baby boomers like to think they invented it, but I'm afraid that was not the case.
That's interesting. So what was the path to publication for you for your first novel, Overseas? Was that the first novel you had written, or had you always wanted to be a novelist?
Well, I'd always wanted to be a novelist. My father wanted to steer me, as I think most responsible fathers would, to something a little more practical. And so I ended up getting an MBA in finance and being a management consultant. And then once I had kids, I thought, I really enjoyed being home with my kids, but I also really felt that I did sort of need something a little more as sort of a, one little pizza slice of the whole pie to call my own. And so I said, okay, I'm just going to, I had always sort of dabbled in writing and sort of kept some sort of, a half-finished novel on my laptop somewhere. But I really got serious about it when my third child was a toddler. And so I started writing, and, I had some ideas, and I didn't quite pull it all together until I had the idea for Overseas, which it was the first time I had really felt the characters and the story and the whole arc kind of come together in my head. And I sat down, and I had thought about it for a long period of time, and it dealt with a historical period that I was, fascinated by. So by the time I sat down to actually read it, it really only took me about, 6 weeks of very insomniac and all involving effort. But I drafted it in 6 weeks, spent a few months revising and editing, because the heroine was actually, I've always considered myself more of a historical fiction writer, but the heroine of Overseas and the narrator is a modern woman. So I had that sort of modern voice, that modern first-person voice, is something that I hadn't really tried before, so it took some polishing before I felt I sort of got it right. And then, after brushing it up, I sent it to a few agents, and really right away, Alexandra Machinist, she's now at Janko and Nesbitt, she loved it, and we met, and we sort of, clicked superbly well, and she's been a fantastic guide and coach as well as agent in the past several years.
That's great. So what's the writing process like for you? I mean, you just talked about drafting Overseas in kind of a 6 weeks kind of effort. Do you do a lot of outlining or planning before you start writing, or do you just kind of see where the story takes you?
Yeah, I kind of fall in the middle. I've always been, I was the second child, and so I've always kind of been the diplomat. So maybe it's my natural tendency is to compromise. But I did discover in writing Overseas that really worked for me, even though it was a brutal process in terms of not getting much sleep. And again, I now have 4 children, so it's tough to pull in an all-nighter when you've got to get them to the school bus in the morning. But before I do start a book, I really like to have it in my head, and I don't tend to outline things or write things down. I like to just, picture it in my head as this sort of 3-dimensional puzzle. I know where I'm starting. I know where I'm ending. I know a few key points on the way. I really feel my characters. I know who these people are. And by the time I start, I want to be kind of a little bit in love with them, so that, it gives me the motivation to really sit down and spend time with them every day. And then so I do enjoy that period of really intense drafting, where I do get that first draft out in 6 to 8 weeks. And and then do some revision. And as I've gotten better at this, luckily I don't have to do quite as much revision afterwards. But to me, it's a great process. It's physically demanding, but it's just when you're in the throes of creativity, I may grumble a little bit about how tired I am, but I'm really probably the happiest I can be is in that time.
That's great. Well, given your success with Overseas, your first novel, and now 100 Summers, what advice would you have for aspiring writers who would like to get their own novels published?
Gosh, and definitely the road is different for everybody. But I would say, that first book should really be the book of your heart. I know that you always get all this advice. Well, look at the market. What does the market want? You need to be able to put your book in a slot that editors and agents will recognize. But Overseas was not an easy to categorize book, and I really kind of wrote it because I just had this idea that that wouldn't let me go, and so I sat down and wrote it, and it was really, that's not to say that I wasn't thinking about all those things like plot structure and the technical aspects of writing as I was going along. But it was a book that it was a story that I loved, and I think that really came through in the pages, and it's really that voice. I mean, if an agent or an editor loves the voice, they're like, you can fix any flaws in the plot and characterization later, but it's the voice, I think, that really captures what's going on, and it's the voice that attracts people to the book. So, my advice would be, yes, you have to keep the market in the back of your mind, but write what you really love, because if you're going to try and chase trends, you're always going to be too late. You just need to write books that you love, and if you're lucky, you'll set a new trend, or at least have something that is distinct from everything else that's being submitted to editors, guests, and eventually to bookshelves in your local bookstore.
Great. Well, I know we spoke about beach reads earlier, but I wondered, are there books or writers that you've read in the past year or two that made an impact on you and that you would recommend?
Well, it's a pretty varied lot, and I will issue one caveat, is that I also write, and this is my agent's idea, I also write historical romance under a pen name, Juliana Gray. So my volume of writing has been very high this year. I actually wrote 3 full-length manuscripts. So
oh my gosh, wow.
At the same time, my reading input has not been as high as I like. So sometimes when people ask me what am I reading now, I kind of draw a bit of a blank because I haven't been able to read that much lately, to my sadness. But there's definitely a few writers that I love, and I've actually been lucky enough to meet a few who have become my friends as well. But I still love their writing, so I'm definitely not being nepotistic here by mentioning Lauren Willig, who her The Ashford Affair, if you haven't read it, is this fantastic rendering of Kenya between the wars and the whole that British community there, and the restlessness of the British in particular after the First World War, and it bounces back and forth between modern New York City and England before the war and Kenya afterwards. And it's just a great read. It's a wonderful mystery that unfolds as you go along. Again, Karen White is fantastic. She writes really wonderful, Southern, I guess we call it Southern women's fiction, with often a historical flavor to it. And you know what I really enjoyed reading, and it's a great fun read, is Farewell, Dorothy Parker by Ellen Meister. And it's really a great, if you love Dorothy Parker and her wit and wisdom, she appears as a ghost, advising a sort of a mouthy theater critic on her life and her behavior and how to develop a backbone. So that's a fantastic read too.
That's great. So I actually wasn't aware of the historical romances that you've written under a pen name. I'm curious about that. Had you written some of those prior to Overseas?
No, not at all. It kind of came about a bit serendipitously, as these things do. overseeing when you publish, your first book, and it was, hardcover with, and so there can be a bit of a time lag between, getting the deal done and then actually the book coming out. So my agent and I were thinking, we've got to keep you busy writing because, you've got to keep the muscles, flexed. So she said, well, what about, obviously my background was in historical fiction. My interest was in historical fiction. So she said, well, why not try writing some historical romance? And I said, well, actually, I do have this little idea. And, I sort of grew up, and for me, it was kind of nice. It's funny. I've gotten people saying, gosh, where did she come from with this Shakespeare? But, I sort of grew up in this, sort of bizarre intellectual household where our vacation every year was the Ashland Shakespeare Festival in Oregon. And they kind of brought me there under false pretenses when I was 5. I was thinking festivals, so there'll be rides and, popcorn. And, it was Shakespeare plays. That first year was The Tempest and The Taming of the Shrew. And we were not allowed to go to Richard III. That was considered too grown up. But I did get a flavor for it early. And I had always thought that Love's Labour's Lost, which is kind of a problematic play on certain levels, had potential as a romantic comedy. You had these 4 gentlemen who sort of retired for, 3 years of monastic seclusion away from women in order to lead lives of virtue and sort of, scholastic achievement. And of course, the first thing that happens is 4 lovely ladies show up on their doorstep, the Princess of France and her ladies in waiting. And naturally everyone falls in love, and there's all that, Shakespearean comedy mixed with, the servants having hijinks and the aristocrats falling in love. And I just thought that would make a great romantic trilogy. So I sort of picked up the loose story and turned it into a trilogy set in Florence, featuring English people, or Florence, the Tuscany generally, and sort of the mountains. And one set of gentlemen is leasing a castle for a year, for their year of, seclusion from society. And of course, 3 women show up and they claim to have a lease on the exact same castle. So it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. And we got some great reviews on it. And so now I'm working on trilogy number 2.
Great.
And that's been a lot of fun as well.
And what was the pen name again?
Juliana Gray, Gray. We that was before 50 Shades came around. So now I have to be very. It's not EY, it's AY. But all things gray. Hopefully.
Yeah.
You never know.
So what are you working on now? What are you writing now?
I just turned in my manuscript for next year, and that sort of juggles back and forth between 1964 Manhattan and 1914 Berlin, right before the outbreak of the First World War, and that was a lot of fun. The 1964 heroine really sort of jumped off the page for me, and she was a lot of fun to write. Her name is Vivian, and she's certainly a vibrant and outspoken character, which are always the best to write. And then, as I said, I'm working on my next Juliana Gray trilogy. I'm working on, I think, book 3 it is right now. So definitely keeping busy. I have A Hunt in Summer is releasing on May 30th, and my Juliana Gray book, How to Tame Your Duke, is coming out on June 4th. So it's a bit busy.
Great. Well, where can people find you online if they're interested in learning more?
Just at www.beatrizwilliams.com. I'm also on Facebook, and the Juliana Gray names as well are just julianagray.com, and Facebook is Juliana Gray, and Twitter as well. BC Williams Books is my Twitter handle. You would think that Beatriz Williams, especially with a Z, Beatriz, would be would not be a common name out there, but actually there were several Beatriz Williamses, so I had to fiddle around quite a bit before I got a coherent Twitter handle.
That's interesting. Well, again, we've been speaking with Beatriz Williams. Her new novel, 100 Summers, is in bookstores now. Beatriz, thanks for doing this interview.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.